He thought that controlling the house through cameras would be enough to keep chaos away. But on Christmas Eve, something on the screen made him lean back in his chair with his heart racing. "How did she know that?" he murmured, watching the woman interact with his deaf triplets. From that day on, everything changed. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. New York City, December. The Christmas lights illuminated Fifth Avenue with a commercial cheer that invaded shop windows, buildings and every corner of the city that never sleeps. But that cheer didn't quite reach the upscale Upper East Side, where Ryan Miller lived alone with his 3 young sons in a 3-story mansion that felt more like a silent museum than a home. Alone was an exaggeration, technically speaking, because there was always someone hired to take care of the house, the children, the food, the meticulously planned routine. But alone was exactly how he felt when he closed the master bedroom door at night, and the silence of the enormous house swallowed him whole. A silence that wasn't just the absence of noise, but the absence of life, of warmth, of laughter, of kitchen conversations, of everything that home once represented. The house had 6 bedroom suites, a dining room that could seat 20, a gourmet kitchen with appliances that cost more than an economy car, a heated pool in the backyard, and a second-floor office from which Ryan ran his tech empire. Every room was decorated with designer furniture, paintings by contemporary artists, and Persian rugs that Megan had chosen with such care in the early years of their marriage. But now it all felt like a set. Beautiful, expensive, empty. The walls echoed with solitary footsteps. The guest rooms remained closed for months on end, and the living room, which should have been the heart of the home, was kept locked because Ryan couldn't bear to see the family portraits hanging there, frozen in a time that would never return. Ryan was 42, the owner of a tech company that brought in millions a year, with Italian suits in his closet and a Swiss watch on his wrist worth more than most cars on the street. Self-taught, the son of small business owners from Queens, he had built everything from scratch. He started out coding in internet cafes, spent sleepless nights creating apps, took risky loans, and turned a garage startup into a company that now served multinational corporations. Success, money, recognition. Everything he had dreamed of as a poor kid looking at the illuminated skyscrapers of Manhattan. But none of it mattered when he walked down the marble hallway and saw the scattered toys, the Christmas tree set up by a decorator he'd never even met, and the 3 colorful high chairs at the kitchen table, always empty because the boys preferred to eat in the playroom where they could make a mess without being watched. Megan had been gone for 2 years, so suddenly that Ryan still woke up some mornings expecting to find her on the balcony, drinking coffee in those blue silk pajamas she loved. The goodbye came with no warning, no time to prepare, no chance for final words or whispered promises. One day she was there, smiling at the triplets who had just turned 1, getting the house ready for their birthday party, talking about plans for the future, about trips they would take when the kids were older. And the next, she left a void so deep that no amount of money, no professional success, no business achievement could fill it. Ryan never talked about how she passed, not to his family, not to his close friends, not even to himself on sleepless nights. He locked it all away in a sealed compartment of his memory and threw away the key. He preferred to focus on what he could control: the company, the finances, the routine, the schedules. He turned his pain into spreadsheets, strategic meetings, and growth targets, because feeling was dangerous. Feeling meant falling apart, and he couldn't afford that luxury. Not with 3 children depending on him. The triplets were now 3 years old. Gabriel, Miguel, and Raphael, 3 identical boys with curly brown hair, dark eyes, and rosy cheeks that looked like they belonged in a baby formula ad. They were beautiful, physically perfect, healthy. Except they lived in a world of their own. In their first few months of life, Ryan and Megan noticed something was different. The babies didn't react to loud noises, didn't turn when someone called their name, weren't startled by slamming doors. After months of appointments, tests, and renowned specialists, in New York and even out of the country, the diagnosis came down like a sentence: profound bilateral deafness in all 3. Irreversible. Incurable. With no hope of change. Megan reacted with strength at first. She started studying American Sign Language, bought books, hired speech therapists, and turned the house into a stimulation center. Ryan, on the other hand, threw himself into his work. It was his way of coping, of maintaining control, of feeling like there was still something in his life he could manage, because the boys were a chaos that defied any spreadsheet, any business logic. They couldn't communicate like other children their age. They didn't speak, didn't understand verbal commands, and the attempts to teach ASL to such young children were slow, frustrating, and filled with tantrums and misunderstandings. They tested limits with an energy that seemed endless. They knocked things over, tore up papers, ran through the house aimlessly, and had crying fits that no one could soothe because no one understood what they wanted. The staff came and went like a revolving door. Ryan had already lost count of how many nannies, caregivers, and even specialized educators had quit or simply stopped showing up. The first one lasted 5 days. The second made it 2 weeks and left in tears after Miguel had a frustration-fueled meltdown. The third had ASL certification and experience with special needs children, but resigned, claiming the responsibility was just too much. There was always an excuse, but the real reason was always the same. The routine was exhausting. The boys woke up early, full of energy. Breakfast turned into a battlefield, food thrown on the floor, plates knocked over, inexplicable tantrums because no one could understand what they wanted. Bath time was another war. Gabriel hated water on his face. Miguel would only take a shower if he could bring all his toys with him. Raphael cried from start to finish as if getting clean were a form of torture, and the communication, or lack thereof, made everything worse. The boys couldn't say when they were hungry, sleepy, or in pain. They pointed, pulled, pushed, cried, and screamed guttural sounds. The attempts to teach them ASL were slow and frustrating. At 3 years old, they should have been forming simple signed sentences, but they could barely hold their attention for 2 minutes. The hard truth was that nobody wanted to deal with it. With the noisy silence of 3 children who screamed without sound, who asked for things with desperate gestures that no one could decode, who cried out of frustration because the world didn't understand them, and they didn't understand the world. Now it was December again, and Ryan looked at the Christmas tree in the living room with a mix of irony and desperation. Expensive decorator, imported ornaments, lights synchronized to music that no one in that house could hear. He had arranged it all himself because his family was coming over on the 24th. His mother, his uncles, a few cousins, people who pretended to understand, who put on a pitying face when they saw the triplets, who offered empty advice about patience and faith. Ryan needed everything to be perfect, not for the boys, who barely cared about Christmas decorations, but for himself, to keep up appearances, to prove he still had control over something. And for that, he needed someone permanent in the house, someone who wouldn't quit after the first week, someone who would clean, cook, organize, and, most importantly, keep the boys away from any situation that could embarrass him in front of his guests. It wasn't a romantic or emotional request. It was practical, cold, necessary. Ryan placed a generous ad, above-market salary, a room in a luxury home on the Upper East Side, all meals included, a comfortable bedroom. Dozens of resumes came in. He conducted quick, direct, no-nonsense interviews. He dismissed those who seemed too fragile, those who asked too many questions about the boys, those who showed excessive pity. Until Laura arrived. She showed up at the door on a Thursday morning, 15 days before Christmas. There was nothing special about her appearance. A woman around 40, thin, with black hair tied in a simple bun, discreet clothing, no makeup. She didn't smile when Ryan opened the door. She just greeted him with a nod and waited to be invited in. Ryan found it strange right away. He was used to nervous candidates, anxious to please, who complimented the house, who made small talk about the weather or the traffic. Laura did none of that. She came in, looked around with a calm, attentive gaze, and sat in the chair Ryan indicated without showing any awe at the crystal chandelier or the marble floors. The interview was strange. From the start, different from all the others Ryan had conducted in recent weeks. He asked his usual questions, following the mental script he had developed: previous experience, references, availability, salary expectations. Laura answered everything with an almost mechanical objectivity, without embellishing her answers, without trying to impress. She had worked in private homes before, both in New York City and upstate. She was familiar with the routines of children of all ages. She knew how to cook home-style meals, more elaborate dishes, and even some gluten-free and lactose-free recipes for allergies. Cleaning wasn't a problem. She had worked in large houses and knew how to organize spaces. She didn't have a permanent position because she preferred temporary work for personal reasons she didn't detail, but she could provide good recommendations from previous employers. Ryan asked if she had children. Laura looked down at her hands for a second before answering no. There was something in the pause, something in the way she averted her gaze, that made Ryan mentally note it as a point of concern. He then asked if she had experience with special needs children, with any specific conditions. She hesitated again, but this time the hesitation seemed more calculated, as if she were choosing her words carefully. She said yes. She had worked with a deaf child a few years ago for a family in Stamford. She didn't offer more details, and Ryan didn't press, but he felt that pang of suspicion he always felt when someone brought up the boys. People tended to react in one of two ways when they found out about the triplets. Either they became overly sympathetic, with a performative compassion that dripped from their words like sickeningly sweet honey, or they became visibly uncomfortable, wanting to change the subject as quickly as possible. Laura did neither. She just nodded as if the information were relevant but not surprising, and waited for the next question. Ryan was about to ask about her immediate availability when he heard the characteristic noise. Not exactly a noise, but that combination of rapid footsteps, high-pitched giggles, and sudden movement that announced the triplets' arrival like a small domestic tornado. He glanced at the clock. 3:30 in the afternoon. The temporary caregiver who was watching them that week was supposed to have taken them to the park, but apparently plans had changed, as they always did. When it came to those three, the living room door burst open and the three of them stormed in. Gabriel pulled an ornament off the Christmas tree, Miguel knocked a cushion off the sofa, and Raphael went straight for the coffee table, grabbing a picture frame that Ryan didn't even remember was there. Ryan stood up in an automatic reflex, ready to impose order the way he always did. Firm gestures, a serious expression, trying to capture the attention of all three at once. But they completely ignored him, as they always did when they got into this state of chaotic energy. Gabriel was already trying to climb the tree, Miguel was running in circles, and Raphael was holding the picture frame with a curiosity that bordered on obsession. That's when Laura moved. Without asking for permission, without waiting for authorization, she got up from her chair and went to the boys. But she didn't approach them standing up. She knelt down, getting on their level, and did something Ryan had never seen any other employee do. She clapped her hands once hard, but not to get their attention with the sound. The movement was visual, broad, and she accompanied it with a marked, almost theatrical facial expression. The three boys stopped, not because they understood an order, but because they were curious about this different gesture. Laura then began to make gestures with her hands. They weren't random gestures. They were simple, intuitive movements, almost like a dance with her hands. She pointed to the tree, made a gesture of negation by shaking her head, then pointed to the sofa and made a sitting motion. Gabriel dropped the ornament and watched her intently. Miguel stopped running. Raphael, still holding the picture frame, took a few steps toward her. Ryan was frozen. It wasn't formal ASL. It was nothing he recognized from the methods the therapists used. But it was working. In less than 3 minutes, Laura had all three of them sitting on the floor around her, watching as she picked up some scattered toys and arranged them in a row. She used exaggerated facial expressions, rhythmic movements, and the boys seemed mesmerized. For the first time in weeks, they were quiet, without being scared or physically restrained. Ryan sat back down, but he didn't relax. This whole thing made him even more suspicious. How did she know how to do that? Where did this skill come from? He cleared his throat and said he was hiring her, but with clear conditions. Strict hours, salary deposited on the agreed-upon day, discipline as a priority. Laura nodded, accepting everything without negotiation. She said she could start the next day. Ryan gave her a spare key, quickly explained the house routine, and ended the conversation. But as Laura left, carrying a small bag and a look that seemed to know more than it should, Ryan felt a tightness in his chest. Something about that woman didn't add up. It wasn't incompetence. Quite the opposite. It was the excess of competence. The way she looked at the boys wasn't with pity, nor with distant professionalism. It was with recognition, as if she saw something in them that no one else did, as if she already knew these children from somewhere else, from another time. That night, Ryan stayed up late in his office, watching the security cameras that covered the entire house. He had installed the system after Megan passed, telling himself it was for protection, for security. But the truth was it had become a habit of control. He would watch. The recordings when he couldn't sleep, when he needed to make sure everything was in order, that nothing deviated from the script he was trying to maintain. Now, looking at the dark screens of the cameras that would only be activated when Laura started the next day, Ryan felt an unease he couldn't name. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was a visceral feeling that this woman wasn't here just for money or a job. There was a bigger, hidden, dangerous reason, and he needed to find out what it was before it was too late. Outside the Christmas, lights continued to blink on the avenue, indifferent to the heavy silence that hung over the enormous house. Inside, 3 children slept in their rooms, oblivious to their father's suspicions and the secrets of the woman who had just entered their lives. And Ryan, sitting alone in his dark office, wondered if hiring Laura had been the best decision of his life or the biggest mistake he had ever made. Laura started the next day, a sunny Friday that seemed to promise a quiet weekend. She arrived promptly at 7 in the morning, as agreed, with a simple backpack and a shopping bag whose contents Ryan didn't ask about. He was finishing his coffee in the kitchen when she came in through the back door, greeted him with a discreet nod, and went straight to the room he had assigned her on the first floor, near the boys' room. She didn't ask for a tour of the house, didn't ask where things were, didn't show any curiosity about the luxurious rooms. She simply put her things away and came down to start work. The first week was strangely efficient. The house, which always had an air of controlled chaos even, with staff trying to keep order, now had an almost military-like organization. Clothes washed, folded, and put away with a perfection Ryan hadn't seen since Megan personally took care of those things. Meals ready on time, with dishes the boys actually ate instead of throwing on the floor. Toys organized in specific bins by type and color, something no other employee had managed to maintain for more than 2 days. Crumb-free floors, even after the triplets' chaotic meals. Spotless bathrooms, towels folded with aligned corners, toiletries restocked before they even ran out. Ryan would come home after long meetings, tired and tense, and find everything running like a well-oiled machine. The boys were clean in matching clothes, fed, and reasonably calm by their standards. There were no endless crying fits, no desperate calls from the caregiver asking for help, no impossible mess to control. The routine finally seemed to be under control, running on its own, without needing his constant presence overseeing every detail. But instead of feeling relieved, instead of finally relaxing and enjoying the fact that he had hired someone competent, Ryan felt a growing discomfort that he couldn't name or explain to himself. It was as if something was too right to be true, as if all that efficiency, that almost inhuman perfection, was hiding something beneath the polished surface. It was the feeling of being deceived without being able to prove it, of seeing only the tip of an iceberg while something much larger remained submerged and invisible. He started noticing small details that bothered him. Laura learned her way around the house too quickly. On the second day, she already knew where the cleaning supplies were without asking. On the third day, she found a locked cabinet in the pantry, and when Ryan got home from work, she had the key in her hand saying she needed to get some dish towels that were stored there. He didn't remember giving her that key. Small things started to disappear and reappear in different places, always in ways that seemed innocent but left Ryan increasingly uneasy. A picture frame that always sat on the living room bookshelf, showing a photo of Megan smiling on the beach in the Hamptons during their honeymoon, appeared on the nightstand in Ryan's bedroom. An old music box that had belonged to Megan, an heirloom from her grandmother that played a Viennese waltz kept in a locked drawer in the closet that only Ryan had access to, was found on top of the piano in the parlor. its lid open and the porcelain ballerina positioned as if someone had recently wound it up. A green wool scarf that Megan used to wear in the winter, stored in a memory box in the hallway closet, appeared folded on the kitchen table. A book of poetry that Megan loved, always on the second shelf of her office bookcase, was on the living room coffee table with a bookmark on a specific poem about goodbyes. Each moved object was like a ghost returning to haunt him, and Ryan didn't know whether to feel anger or fear. When he finally confronted Laura about the objects, she was preparing the boys' dinner, chopping vegetables with surgical precision. She answered without even looking up from the cutting board, with that disconcerting naturalness that had become her trademark. She said yes, she had been cleaning and reorganizing things around the house, taking objects from places where they collected dust and putting them in spaces where they could be seen, appreciated, remembered. She said that a house full of memories stored in locked drawers and closets was a house that denied its own past, and that wasn't healthy for either Ryan or the children. The answer was logical. It even made sense in a psychological way that Ryan didn't want to admit. But the way she looked at him when she finished speaking carried something more. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, it was knowledge. As if she knew exactly what those objects meant, what the story was behind each one, why Ryan had hidden them instead of throwing them away or donating them, as if she had an emotional map of that house that no one but Megan could have drawn. It was then that Ryan began to use the security cameras with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. He had always had the system installed, 16 high-resolution cameras scattered throughout the house, covering every hallway, every room, every common space except for the bathrooms and private bedrooms. The system was top of the line, installed by a luxury home security company, with cameras that worked perfectly even in the dark, with digital zoom that allowed him to see tiny details, and with cloud storage for up to 90 days of continuous recording. After Megan passed, he would watch the recordings occasionally, more as a way to feel in control of the house than out of any real security need. He liked to see the boys playing when he was at work, to check if the temporary staff were doing their jobs properly, to have the illusion that it was still possible to watch over everything, predict everything, control everything. But now it had become a genuine, compulsive, unhealthy obsession. He would spend hours in his office at work with his phone screen open, showing the live feeds from the house in a real time. He would turn down the volume on important meetings so he could watch Laura move through the rooms like a silent shadow. He saw her caring for the boys with a patience that seemed infinite, preparing food with precise and economical movements, cleaning with an efficiency that turned household chores into a choreography. He developed a sick routine. He would wake up half an hour earlier every morning to watch the previous night's recordings on fast forward. During the day, he kept a browser tab always open with the live cameras. At night, before bed, he would review the moments he had marked as suspicious. He was sleeping less, eating worse, losing focus in work meetings. His partners started making veiled comments about him being too distracted, absent, disconnected from the company's numbers and strategies. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. She worked efficiently, without rushing but without wasting time. She treated the boys with a combination of firmness and patience that Ryan had never seen in any other employee. When Gabriel had a tantrum and started crying and stomping his feet, Laura would simply sit next to him and wait. She didn't try to calm him down, didn't get nervous, didn't call Ryan in desperation. She just waited until the storm passed, and when the boy finally calmed down, she would gently wipe his face and continue with the routine as if nothing had happened. But it was in the second week that Ryan started seeing things that genuinely disturbed him. On a Tuesday afternoon, he was in a tedious video conference with investors when he muted his sound and opened the camera feed for the playroom. Laura was there with the 3 boys, so far normal, except she had brought objects that Ryan had never seen in the house before. There were children's musical instruments scattered on the floor, a small colorful drum, rattles of different sizes, a plastic keyboard, a metal triangle, maracas, a xylophone. Ryan frowned. Why on earth was she giving musical instruments to children who couldn't hear? He watched with redoubled attention. Laura picked up the drum and hit it, not hard, but with rhythmic, steady beats. The boys looked at her with curiosity. She then placed Gabriel's hand on top of the drum and hit it again. The boy smiled. A real smile, something Ryan saw so rarely that he always took a mental picture when it happened. Gabriel pressed his face against the drum as Laura continued to beat it, as if he were feeling something that wasn't visible, something coming from inside the instrument. Ryan completely stopped paying attention to the meeting. The investors continued talking about profit projections, but his eyes were fixed on the small screen of his phone. Laura did the same thing with Miguel and Rafael. She placed their hands on the instruments while she produced sounds, and both reacted with expressions of fascination, of discovery. It wasn't normal. Deaf children weren't supposed to react that way to sound stimuli, unless they weren't completely deaf. The idea shot through Ryan's mind like a lightning bolt, and he immediately pushed it away. Impossible. The tests were clear. Multiple specialists had confirmed it. Profound bilateral deafness, with no possibility of reversal. He and Megan had heard it so many times, it had become an absolute truth, an unchangeable fact of their lives. But then, why was that scene affecting him so much? In the following days, Ryan intensified his surveillance. He watched the previous night's recordings in the morning before going to work, paused meetings to check the live feeds, and came home early making up excuses. And the more he watched, the more strange things he saw. Laura used the instruments every day, always in the same methodical way. She had the children touch their hands, their feet, sometimes even their entire faces to the objects while she produced vibrations, and they reacted. Not always, not obviously, but they reacted. A different look, an unexpected smile, a head movement that seemed too intentional to be a coincidence. There was also the matter of Megan's personal belongings. Ryan began to notice that Laura handled them with a frequency and familiarity that made no sense. He saw on the recordings her picking up the music box, opening it carefully, touching the porcelain ballerina that spun inside. He saw her taking a silk scarf that was stored in a drawer in their closet, unfolding it, smelling it, folding it back with an almost reverent care. He saw her looking at old photos hanging on the hallway wall, photos of Ryan and Megan on trips, at parties, in happy moments that now seemed to have happened in another lifetime. Every time he saw these scenes, Ryan felt a mixture of anger and confusion. Anger because this woman was invading memories that didn't belong to her. Confusion because the way she looked at those objects wasn't with curiosity or greed. It was with recognition. As if she already knew these things from before, from another place, from another time. The last straw came on a Thursday, 10 days after Laura had started working. Ryan was in his home office, supposedly reviewing contracts, but actually watching the cameras in real time. It was noon, and Laura had put the boys down for their afternoon nap. She went down to the kitchen, made a coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the yard. Ryan thought she was going to take a break, rest a little, but after a few minutes, she left the coffee cup in the sink, went upstairs, and headed for a room that no one had used in years. Megan's old office on the second floor. Ryan's heart began to race. That room was locked. He himself had locked it months after Megan passed, unable to bear seeing her space preserved like a shrine. The desk still had her papers, pens, a turned-off computer. The shelves held books she loved. There were dried plants on the windowsills, dead from lack of water and care. It was a place of ghosts, of memories too painful to visit. But Laura went in. She simply opened the door as if she had the key, entered, and closed it behind her. Ryan turned up the camera's volume, but there was no sound in that specific room. He saw her walking slowly through the space, touching things, running her fingers along the spines of the books, picking up a notebook that was on the desk. She opened the notebook, read a few pages, brought a hand to her face as if she were crying, closed the notebook and put it back in the exact same spot. Ryan couldn't take it anymore. He shut down his computer, went downstairs making noise on purpose so she would know he was home, went up to the second floor and knocked on the door of Megan's office. Laura opened it almost immediately, her face calm with no trace of guilt or surprise. "You went in here," was the first thing Ryan said, his voice coming out more aggressive than he intended. "I did," Laura replied, simply. "How do you have the key to this room?" I found it in a kitchen drawer with some other old keys. Ryan knew she was lying. He kept all the important keys with him, always. But before he could confront her, Laura continued, I'm sorry if I intruded on a space I shouldn't have. I saw this room had been closed for a long time and thought it needed a cleaning. There's mold on the curtains and the plants have been dead for years. The explanation was reasonable, but Ryan couldn't accept it. Not when he had seen her, crying while reading Megan's notebook. Not when every fiber of his being screamed that something was very wrong here. He stood in the doorway, torn between the urge to fire Laura on the spot and the fear of the chaos that would return to his life if she left. Don't touch my late wife's personal things again, he finally said, with a coldness that surprised even himself. You were hired to take care of the house and the children. That's it. Laura nodded without saying anything, left the room and went down the hall. Ryan stood there for a few more minutes looking around Megan's office, feeling the weight of the memories crashing down on him like an avalanche. When he finally left and locked the door again, putting the key in his pocket, he swore to himself that he would find out who Laura really was. Because with every passing day, every scene he saw on the cameras, every small gesture she made, he became more convinced of one thing. This woman was not here by chance, and whatever she was looking for had nothing to do with a salary or a job. Christmas was approaching with a speed that made Ryan increasingly tense. The house had been decorated since the beginning of December, with a nearly 10-foot tree in the main living room, imported wreaths on the doors, twinkling white lights in every window, and a vintage Italian nativity scene at the entrance. Everything impeccable, everything perfect, everything exactly as guests would expect to see in an Upper East Side mansion. But behind the festive facade, Ryan's suspicion grew like a shadow, swallowing every room. 3 days before Christmas Eve, he made a decision. He invented an urgent business trip, told Laura he needed to sort something out in Stamford, and would only be back late in the afternoon on the 24th around the time of the dinner. He packed a bag with clothes, put it in the car in the garage to make the lie convincing, and on the morning of the 23rd, he left the house as if he were really traveling. Laura barely reacted to the news, just nodding and saying she would take care of everything while he was away. Ryan drove to a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, checked in, left his bag in the room, and returned home 2 hours later, entering silently. Through the side door that led directly to his second-floor office, he locked himself in there with water, coffee, a few sandwiches, and a fierce determination to finally uncover the truth about this woman. He had 3 computer screens set up on his desk, each showing different camera feeds. He wasn't going to miss a single movement. The first few hours of the 23rd were too normal to calm Ryan down. Laura woke the boys up at the usual time, prepared breakfast, and bathed all 3 with a patience that remained impressive even after weeks. She took them to the playground in the backyard, played a visual game of tag using exaggerated gestures that made them laugh. Lunch, afternoon nap, snack. Everything within the established routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Ryan began to question if he was going crazy, if all this paranoia was just a reflection of his own unprocessed trauma. But then came Christmas Eve, December 24th, and everything changed. The morning started like any other. Laura woke up early, even before the sun had fully risen. She made her coffee, drank it in silence, looking out the kitchen window, then went upstairs and woke the boys. Ryan watched everything from his 3 screens, noting times, behaviors, trying to find patterns that might reveal hidden intentions. Breakfast went without incident. The triplets were particularly restless, perhaps sensing the different energy of the approaching holiday, or perhaps just being 3-year-olds with infinite energy and no self-control. Around 10 in the morning, after the boys finished playing in the living room, Laura did something different. She took all 3 of them to the playroom on the first floor. So far, nothing unusual. But then she closed the curtains in the room, plunging the space into a dimness that the night vision cameras captured perfectly. She moved furniture aside, creating a large circular space in the center of the room, and then she brought out those musical instruments Ryan had seen before, only this time in much greater quantity. There was a large professional drum, the kind used in a drumline, a small portable speaker which she connected to her phone, metal pots of various sizes, turned upside down, a small electronic keyboard, rattles, maracas, triangles, cymbal plates. She arranged everything in a circle, like some kind of sound altar, and had the three boys sit in the center. Ryan leaned forward in his office chair, his heart beating faster. What the hell was she doing? Laura started slowly. She took the large drum and hit it once, hard. Ryan couldn't hear it through the muted cameras, but he saw the visual impact of the movement, the reverberation that must have been filling the room. The boys looked at the drum with curiosity. She hit it again, and this time she placed Gabriel's hand on the stretched skin of the instrument while continuing to beat it with her other hand. The boys' eyes widened, not in fear but in discovery. Laura did the same thing with Miguel and Raphael. She let them feel the vibration of the drum through the palms of their hands, through direct contact with the source of the sound. And all three reacted. These weren't small or ambiguous reactions. They were clear, undeniable, consistent reactions. Gabriel smiled that wide grin that rarely appeared. Miguel clapped his hands, imitating her movement. Raphael pressed his entire face against the drum, as if he wanted to dive into the vibration. Ryan felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't normal. Completely deaf children shouldn't react like this. He had. Read everything about profound deafness when the boys were diagnosed. He had consulted the best specialists in New York, in Chicago, even in Miami. They all said the same thing: profound bilateral deafness with no possibility of sound perception. The children could feel strong vibrations through touch, but that wasn't hearing. It was just a physical sensation, with no neurological connection to auditory processing. But what he was seeing on the screens seemed like much more than a simple tactile reaction. There was intentionality. There was recognition. There was something he couldn't name, but that shook every certainty he had, built over the last 2 years. Laura continued the session for almost an hour. She used different instruments, tested various frequencies through the speaker, and observed each reaction with an almost scientific attention. She jotted things down in a small notebook she had brought with her. Sometimes she cried silently, wiping away tears with the back of her hand without stopping what she was doing. Ryan saw everything, absorbed every detail, felt his own mind being rewritten in real time. The most impactful scene happened around 11:30. Laura positioned Gabriel with his back to her, out of the boys' line. Of sight. She stood about 10 feet away. She took 2 cymbal plates and crashed them together, creating a sound that Ryan imagined to be sharp and piercing. Gabriel turned his head. Not completely, not in the exact direction, but he turned. And when Laura crashed them again, the boy moved, visually searching for the source of what he had perceived. Ryan paused the image, rewound it, watched it again and again. He tried to find an alternative explanation, a draft, a shadow, a reflection of light, a coincidence. But there was none of that. The environment was controlled, isolated, free of external variables. The reaction had been to the sound, and there was no denying it. He picked up his phone with trembling hands and looked for the contact of a specialist he had consulted months ago, a renowned pediatric ENT specialist who practiced at a private hospital in Murray Hill. He explained that he needed an urgent appointment, that it was an emergency, that he would pay whatever was necessary. The receptionist said it was Christmas Eve, and the doctor was already on vacation. Ryan insisted, offering triple the consultation fee. 15 minutes later, he received confirmation. The doctor could see them at 3 in the afternoon. Ryan came down from his office, making as much noise as possible, slamming doors, calling for Laura. She appeared on the stairs with a calm expression, as if she had been expecting it. "I'm back early," he said, his voice louder than he intended. "We need to take the boys to the doctor, now." Laura didn't ask why. She showed no surprise. She just said she would get the boys ready, and they would be good to go in 20 minutes. The drive to the doctor's office was tense and silent. The triplets were in their car seats in the back, too well-behaved for children who usually hated the car. Laura sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window without saying a word. Ryan drove on autopilot, his mind spinning in loops of contradictory thoughts. What if the previous tests were wrong? What if there was something everyone had missed? What if Laura had discovered in weeks what specialists hadn't seen in years? The doctor, Dr. Henry Wallace, was a man in his 60s with greying hair and thin-rimmed glasses. He received them in a private room in his office, away from the usual hustle and bustle of the emergency department. He examined the three boys with patience and precision, repeating tests that Ryan had seen dozens of times: otoscopy, acoustic reflex, tympanometry, behavioral observation, an hour and a half of tests that felt like an eternity. When he finally called Ryan in to talk, the doctor had that expression healthcare professionals develop when they have to deliver difficult news without completely destroying hope. "Mr. Miller, the tests confirm the previous diagnosis," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Your sons have profound bilateral deafness. The structure of the inner ear is compromised. There is no detectable cochlear function in conventional tests." Ryan felt the floor disappear from under his feet. "But," the doctor held up a hand, asking for patience. "But," he continued, "there is a known but rare phenomenon that might explain some of the reactions you've described. Certain children with profound deafness develop an extraordinary sensitivity to low-frequency vibrations. It's not hearing in the traditional sense. It's a highly refined form of tactile perception, almost like a sixth sense. They pick up vibrations through their bones, through their entire body, and the brain processes this in a way that can mimic some auditory responses. So they feel it, but they don't hear it. It's a fine line," Dr. Wallace admitted. "Technically, they aren't hearing sounds the way we do, but they are perceiving the sound world in a unique way. With the right stimuli, proper training, this can be developed to improve their communication and quality of life." Ryan returned to the waiting room, stunned. Laura was playing with the boys in a corner, using simple gestures that they followed attentively. He stopped at the door, observing the scene as if seeing it for the first time. This woman had discovered in weeks what he hadn't been able to see in years. And the question burning in his throat was no longer, how did she know how to do this? But why did she care so much? If you were in Ryan's shoes, would you trust Laura right away or stay suspicious? Let us know in the comments. The drive back home was different. Ryan drove more slowly, processing everything the doctor had said. Laura remained quiet, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. When they got home and put the boys down to rest, it was almost 6 in the evening. Christmas Eve dinner was set for 8. The guests would be arriving soon. But Ryan couldn't think about anything but the questions he hadn't asked. He found Laura in the kitchen, preparing the dinner she had started that morning. A turkey roasting in the oven, stuffing ready in a large dish, salads organized in the fridge. Everything perfect, everything on point, as if she hadn't spent the entire afternoon in a doctor's office dealing with revelations that rewrote reality. "We need to talk," Ryan said, his voice firmer than he felt. Laura turned off the oven, wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned to face him. There was something different in her eyes. She was no longer the efficient, discreet employee. She was someone tired of carrying secrets. "I know," she replied simply. They went to the living room, away from the kitchen, away from the rooms where the boys were sleeping. They sat in opposite chairs, like adversaries before a negotiation. Ryan gathered his courage and asked the question he had been avoiding for weeks. "Who are you, for real? And don't give me that story about just being a caregiver who needed a job." Laura took a deep breath. For a moment, Ryan thought she was going to get up and leave without answering. But then she began to speak, and each word was like a stone thrown into a lake, creating ripples that expanded and changed everything. "I worked with a deaf child a few years ago, that's true. But it wasn't just any child. It was me. I was diagnosed with profound deafness when I was a baby. My parents took me to the best doctors, and they all said the same thing you. Heard about your sons. No cure, irreversible, no hope for change." Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. "Go on." "But when I was about 7, a different speech therapist noticed something the others had missed. I reacted to very low-pitched sounds, to specific vibrations. It wasn't normal hearing, but it was something. She developed a special stimulation program for me. It took years, but I learned to use that perception in a way that allowed me to integrate better with the world. I don't hear like you hear. I hear through my entire body, through my bones, my skin. in ways that science still doesn't fully understand. Ryan was mesmerized. And my sons, they have the same pattern I had. I saw it in their eyes the first time I met them. That frustrated search, that feeling of being trapped inside a silence that isn't complete, but that no one else understands. That's why I brought the instruments. That's why I did the tests. Because I needed to be sure before I said anything. It makes sense, Ryan admitted. But there was still something that didn't add up. But that doesn't explain why you're so emotionally involved. Why you cry when you're with them. Why you touch Megan's things. Why you know this house like you've lived here before. Laura closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears she didn't try to hide. Because I didn't come here just to work, Ryan. I came because these children are my family. Megan was my sister, my biological half-sister. We were separated when we were babies, adopted by different families. I only found out a year ago when I started searching for my biological family. And when I finally worked up the courage to try and make contact, I found out it was too late. She was already gone. The silence that followed was so thick it felt solid. Ryan looked at Laura as if seeing her for the first time, searching for similarities, differences, proof. And then he saw it. The eyes. Megan had those same dark, deep eyes. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the slight smile at the corner of her mouth when something surprised her. "You're Megan's sister," he repeated, trying to make the words make sense. "I am. And those 3 boys are my nephews, the only family I have left. That's why I needed to be near them. That's why I agreed to come as an employee instead of showing up and demanding recognition, because I knew you would never believe me. I knew I had to prove that I deserved to be a part of their lives." Ryan's tears came without warning, breaking through years of emotional restraint. He cried for the wife he had lost, for the sons he didn't fully understand, for her sister who had arrived too late, for all the years wasted on incomplete diagnoses and buried hopes. And Laura cried with him, 2 people united by the same loss, the same hope, the same determination to do things differently from now on. Outside, the Christmas lights continued to blink. The guests would start arriving soon. The dinner needed to be finished. But at that moment, inside that room, something far more important than any performative celebration was happening. A new beginning was happening. The truth was finally coming to light. And a family was being formed, not just by blood, but by the choice to be present, to fight together, to turn the impossible into merely difficult. The Christmas Eve dinner that night did happen, but it was completely different from what Ryan had planned. The guests arrived to find a lavish table, a decorated house, but also 2 adults with red-rimmed eyes and 3 children who finally seemed at peace. Ryan's mother, Carol, noticed immediately that something had changed. She didn't ask in front of everyone, but she pulled her son into a corner of the kitchen and demanded to know what was going on. Ryan told her everything, about Laura being Megan's sister, about the discovery of the triplets' different sound perception, about the years lost believing in incomplete diagnoses. Carol listened to it all in silence, then did something that surprised Ryan. She hugged Laura as if she were a daughter returning from a long journey. The news spread quickly among the family members present, and what was supposed to be a formal dinner turned into a gathering filled with tears, hugs, and the feeling that something had finally fallen into its rightful place. But the most impactful revelation was yet to come. It happened the next day, December 25th, Christmas Day itself. The guests had left late the previous night. The house was quiet, with Archaiskin, only the remnants of the party waiting to be cleaned up. Ryan woke up early, unable to go back to sleep after everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He found Laura already awake in the kitchen, making coffee as if it were just another ordinary morning, and not the day after the revelation that changed everything. They had coffee together in silence, processing, reorganizing their thoughts. It was Laura who broke the silence first, asking something that had been left hanging in their conversation the night before. "You kept Megan's things, her personal belongings. I saw there's a locked office upstairs. Would you mind if I saw it? Not to touch anything, just to feel like I'm close to her in some way." Ryan hesitated. That room was an untouched shrine, a place of pain he had avoided for years. But he looked at Laura, at this woman, who was the sister of the person he had loved most in his life, and realized that maybe it was time to open that door, not just physically, but emotionally. They went up to the second floor together. Ryan unlocked the door to Megan's office with hands that trembled, slightly. The room was exactly as she had left it. Dust covered every surface. Dead plants sat on the windowsills. Papers were scattered across her desk. Books on psychology and child development lined the shelves, because Megan had started studying ways to help children with special needs, specifically her own sons. There were photos hanging on the walls, showing happy moments that seemed to have happened in another lifetime. Laura walked through the space as if walking through a sacred museum, gently touching the objects, reading book titles, looking at photos with a painful intensity. She stopped in front of a specific photo. Megan, pregnant, smiling with her hands on her enormous belly, looking at the camera with that mix of fear and hope that all first-time mothers have. Laura touched the glass of the picture frame and cried silently. Ryan watched her from the doorway, feeling his own pain mix with hers. After a few minutes, he entered the room completely, went to a locked cabinet in the corner, and opened it with a key he always carried on his keychain but had never used since Megan passed. Inside were boxes, folders, documents, and a brown leather-bound notebook with Megan's initials engraved in gold. "I never had the courage to read this," Ryan said, picking up the notebook with reverence. It was her personal journal. "I knew it existed, but I always thought it would be too invasive to open after she was gone. But now, I think we need to read it. Together." They sat on the floor of the office, leaning against the wall with the notebook open between them. The first pages were old, from when Megan was pregnant. She wrote about her fears of mothering triplets, her expectations, her dreams for the future. Then came the entries about the deafness diagnosis, pages filled with pain, anger, and questions about why this had happened to them. But as they read on, the tone changed. Megan began to write about acceptance, about alternative forms of communication, about the beauty of raising 3 unique children who would see the world differently. And then, in the final pages, written just a few months before she passed, the entries about searching for her lost sister began. Megan wrote about how she had discovered Laura's existence through a casual search of adoption records, about the shock of finding out she had a biological sister she never knew, separated from her as a baby, by complicated family decisions neither of them had any control over, about the fear of making contact, of being rejected, of opening old wounds, but also about hope, the hope that maybe this sister could be a part of the triplets' lives, could offer a family connection they deserved to have. Ryan and Laura read in silence, tears falling freely, turning the pages with care. And then they reached the last entry, dated 1 week before Megan passed. The text was short but devastating in its simplicity. "Today, I got her address from a retired social worker who handled the adoption. I'm going to find her next week. I'm so scared, but also so hopeful. I want my sons to know their aunt. I want Laura to know she has a family waiting for her. I want her to understand that even though we were separated for so many years, blood connects us, and love can bring us back together." Below, an address was written in pen. It was the address where Laura was living at the time, in Stamford. Megan had gotten so close. If she had lived just a few more days, she would have made contact. She would have opened the door that Laura ended up opening on her own, a year and a half later, when she finally gathered the courage to investigate and discovered that the sister she never knew was no longer there to be found. Laura hugged the notebook to her chest as if she were hugging Megan herself. Ryan put his arm around her shoulders, and the two of them sat there, on the floor of that dusty office, crying together, sharing a pain that had finally found company. They were no longer two strangers brought together by chance. They were family, united by loss but also by the choice to move forward together. In the days that followed Christmas, the house on the Upper East Side began to change in a way that went far beyond decoration or organization. Life was returning to those rooms that had been silent for so long. Laura ceased to be an employee and officially became part of the family. Ryan updated documents, secured her legal rights, and established a trust fund for the nephews. She could now call her own without having to hide the truth. More importantly, they began to work together on the triplets' development. Ryan used all his influence and resources to schedule appointments with specialists in rare cases of atypical auditory perception. Laura shared everything she had learned on her own journey, the exercises that made a difference, the techniques that worked. They set up an entire room dedicated to controlled sound stimuli, with instruments of different frequencies, tactile pads that translated sound into vibration, and state-of-the-art assistive technologies. Gabriel, Miguel, and Raphael began to respond in increasingly consistent ways. It wasn't a miraculous overnight transformation, but it was real, measurable progress. They learned to associate certain vibrations with specific actions. They developed a unique way of communicating that combined formal ASL with signs they invented themselves and reactions to vibratory stimuli. They started to smile more, have fewer frustration-fueled meltdowns, and feel less lost in the silent world they inhabited. Ryan changed too. The man who had hidden behind spreadsheets and obsessive control began to allow himself to feel again. He cried more in those first few months after Christmas than he had in the entire previous 2 years. But they were different tears. They were no longer tears of hopelessness or loneliness. They were tears of healing, of acceptance, of gratitude for having found in Laura not just practical help, but a bridge back to Megan, a way to keep his wife's memory alive through the sister she never had the chance to meet. The house on the Upper East Side was no longer a mausoleum of silence. Megan's office was opened, cleaned, and transformed into a space of shared memories where Ryan and Laura would sometimes sit to talk about her, to keep her presence alive through stories. The photos that had been stored away went back on the walls. Her personal belongings were redistributed throughout the house, not as untouchable shrines, but as gentle reminders that love doesn't end with physical departure. 6 months after the Christmas that changed everything, on a sunny day in June, something happened that Ryan would forever cherish. They were all in the stimulation room, working with the boys on a vibratory perception session. Laura was playing a low-pitched drum at a specific frequency the triplets had learned to associate with the time to stop and pay attention. Gabriel, who had always been the most responsive, wasn't looking directly at her. He was playing with a toy car in the corner of the room. Laura beat the drum 3 times in the pattern they had established as a call, and Gabriel stopped. He dropped the car. He turned completely in her direction. And then, for the first time in his life, he tried to form an intentional vocal sound, combining it with an ASL sign that meant, "I hear you," adapted to, "I perceive you." The sound that came out was guttural, imperfect, but filled with intention. Ryan and Laura looked at each other, their eyes full of tears. It wasn't the perfect sound that conventional parents expect to hear from their children, but it was communication. It was connection. It was Gabriel saying, in the only way his body allowed, that he understood, that he was learning, that he was no longer lost and alone in the silence. In the months that followed, the 3 boys developed their own ways of expressing themselves. They would never speak like children with typical hearing, but they found a language that was theirs, a mix of signs, facial expressions, unique vocalizations, and reactions to vibrations. And more importantly, they found a family that understood them, that didn't try to force them into a mold of normality, but celebrated the unique way they existed in the world. Ryan looked at this family that had formed in such unlikely ways and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the peace of someone who has everything figured out or who no longer faces challenges, but the peace of someone who has finally stopped fighting alone, who has found companionship on the journey, who has learned that family isn't just about blood or a last name, but the daily choice to be present, to fight together, to turn pain into shared strength. And when the triplets ran through the living room, all 3 together in a coordinated chaos of childish energy, hugging Ryan's and Laura's legs, laughing in that unique way only they had, pressing their little hands against the instruments that vibrated like amplified heartbeats, Ryan finally understood. The miracle hadn't been restoring their hearing in the traditional sense. The miracle had been much greater, finding the truth hidden on Christmas Eve, building forgiveness in the days that followed, and forming a family that was born twice, first in the blood that ran, through Megan's and Laura's veins, then in Ryan's conscious choice to open the doors not just of his house, but of his heart. The following Christmas was completely different. No facades, no need to impress anyone, just a real family, with all its imperfections and all its beauty, celebrating not the date on the calendar, but the fact that they were together. Laura prepared the dinner using old recipes Megan had left written down. The triplets helped decorate the tree, each in their own chaotic and charming way. Ryan took thousands of photos, not to post on social media or show to acquaintances, but to keep in albums that would one day tell this story to the boys when they were older. And that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, exhausted from so much play, Ryan and Laura sat on the balcony, looking at the New York City sky illuminated by millions of lights. They talked about Megan, about how happy she would be to see this family united. They talked about the plans for the boys' future, about the therapies that would continue, about the discoveries yet to come. They talked about how life has a strange way of fixing broken things, not by returning them to how they were before, but by creating something new and strong from the pieces. And when Laura said she felt that Megan was there with them in some way, Ryan didn't disagree, because he felt it too. He felt it in the presence of her children, in the love of the sister she never met in person, in the memory that lived on not as a weight of sadness, but as an inspiration for how to live better. Megan had left too soon, without realizing her dream of reuniting the family she had discovered. But through Ryan and Laura, through the triplets who were growing up strong and loved, through every small victory and every moment of genuine connection, that dream was coming true even in her physical absence. And so, in that Upper East Side house that had been a tomb of silence and was transformed into a home full of life, a new story began to be written. Not a perfect story without challenges or difficulties, but a real story of imperfect people choosing to love despite the impossibilities, of unique children finding their own ways to exist, of a family born from chance, shaped by pain, and strengthened by the daily choice not to give up, not to surrender to what seemed impossible, to turn every Christmas Eve not into a reminder of loss, but a celebration of new beginnings. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ryan, Laura, and the triplets Gabriel, Miguel, and Raphael has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of discovery, forgiveness, and family love, click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Have you ever been in a situation where a person who seemed like a stranger turned out to be the fundamental piece that was missing in your life? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest and truest side of the human soul. Stories that make us believe that miracles happen, not when everything is magically resolved, but when we have the courage to open doors we've kept locked out of fear. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will make you reflect on family, love, and the invisible connections that bind us. Even when distance or time try to keep us apart,